So I'm going to ask Danny to start out for a few minutes, just sort of setting the scene of what happened in Hanoi, and then I'm going to engage him in questions and for a while, and then invite questions from all of you. So, Danny?
Thank you, Carol. Thanks, Tom. It's cold comfort to have poured cold water on a diplomatic opening, and now a second time around in Hanoi. I think Hanoi was really a hard lesson in the penalty of not being fully prepared, not really understanding the history of the challenge on the Korean Peninsula, not having done the hard groundwork and foundation laying through a diplomatic set of negotiations to get to a point where it made sense for the two leaders to meet. I think we saw instead the fallacy of the heroic great man, mano a mano, I can do this myself school of diplomacy. President Trump, for his part, put to the test the premise that he could be a salesman. He could dangle great promises of a wonderful future and use his charm to induce Kim Jong Un to denuclearize. It was not a good bet, and he was proven wrong. For Kim's part, I think the North Korean leader put to the test the proposition that Hanoi would be roughly akin to the model of Singapore, where he could get directly to an inexperienced and fairly gullible leader who was hungry for a deal, who was vulnerable to flattery. And when you add the political and legal problems that are playing out on TV real time, I think it's understandable why Kim took that bet, but he was, of course, proven wrong as well. So, Carol, just to do a quick overview of where I think we are, I'd sort of break it up into 5 easy pieces. The first piece is that in the aftermath of the Singapore summit, 8+ months, the U.S. negotiators chased North Koreans all around the globe, trying to catch them and get them to engage in a diplomatic effort, and the North Koreans would not allow themselves to be caught until the second summit was scheduled, and then with just a few weeks to go, the North Korean side condescended to allow Steve Biegun, the U.S. rep, to go to North Korea to meet with them. But they still weren't offering to negotiate. The North Koreans instead were saying, hey, we hit the pause button instead of the fire button, and so it's your turn now to reward us. The second piece, as I see it, is that the U.S. side really weakened its bargaining position, frittered away a considerable amount of leverage through a number of unilateral, I'd say gratuitous public concessions. So first, from President Trump, he's in no hurry to denuclearize, no hurry, take your time. Removing the pressure of time, removing the sense of urgency played right into North Korea's hands, as did the fall in love expressions of affection for Kim and the declaration that the nuclear threat from North Korea was over. That significantly reduced the amount of pressure that the U.S. could bring to bear on North Korea. Secretary Pompeo repeatedly argued the proposition that things were good because there was a freeze in place, because the North Koreans weren't actually launching. The problem is not just the tests, the problem is the manufacturing. The problem is the possession of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So to frame the issue as whether North Korea is actively committing a felony or not is a false model, and worked very much to the North Koreans' favor, as we saw when they actually did make a proposal. And then the special representative himself, Steve Biegun, made a number of statements in a speech on the West Coast about how the U.S. side would not ask or expect the North Koreans to declare what they possessed, where their facilities were, until the very end of the denuclearization process. He He said the U.S. was fine with a peace treaty, was fine with the start of normalization through liaison offices. Those might not in and of themselves be bad things, but concessions belong in the trade, in the back and forth of negotiations. When you make concessions unilaterally, publicly, to show the other side that you're really a nice guy, that you're really hungry for a deal, you may not be doing yourself any favor in the long term. Third piece was that after the Singapore summit, sanctions enforcement began to weaken. The UN reports, the UN has a monitoring panel that looks at implementation of sanctions and has reported massive rise in trade, in illegal trade, to North Korea's benefit. South Korea has successfully applied for waivers from the sanctions and is pushing for business deals. China is now publicly, formally calling for the removal of sanctions in the UN Security Council. At the same time, international solidarity, that sort of wall of pressure and opprobrium that surrounded North Korea, has broken apart. North Korea's isolation is over. Kim Jong Un is received as a glorious, normal head of state in various capitals. The United States' relationship with China and with Russia arguably could barely be worse than it is right now. So unity is broken in those important relationships. The South Koreans are actively pursuing North-South rapprochement. There's some real daylight between us. And Japan is very focused on the fact that the discussion with North Korea about missiles has been limited to the intercontinental missiles that could hit the United States, not the short-range missiles that threaten Japan. So there's a lot of fragmentation. Fourth is that the U.S. came to Hanoi with what they call a grand bargain. This is what in the Obama and the Bush administration we called more for more. Get out of the trap of trading tiny little pieces with the North Koreans and never get anywhere. Let's make a big deal and sell it to them. Well, it's not a new idea, and it's not a good idea. It simply doesn't work. And one of the reasons it doesn't work is that it's predicated on North Korea believing that the President of the United States is going to deliver these great results over many years, when they know perfectly well that the term of any U.S. president is limited. Put it this way, North Korea doesn't take personal checks, and it's not going to take the word of a U.S. president, let alone a U.S. president who has something of a track record for reversing himself. And lastly, the North Koreans themselves came to Hanoi with a proposal, a front-loaded proposal that would trade the lift of sanctions, and there's been some debate about how many and which ones, but fundamentally the biting sanctions on sectors, a lift of sanctions in return for some or all of a single, important, but still a single nuclear site, Yongbyon. It was a nice try. I think there was a chance. It wasn't unreasonable for the North Koreans to gamble that they could have gotten President Trump to agree to that kind of a trade. It made no mention of the existing North Korean nuclear weapons, the existing intercontinental ballistic missiles, the existing fissile material. It was only about future production. If they could have gotten that deal, they would have been significantly advantaged by it. But they didn't, notwithstanding the political and the legal problems that President Trump faced. So from their point of view, it was a gamble worth trying. It didn't pan out this time, perhaps because of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. If that's the case, it's likely to have reinforced the North Koreans' determination not to deal with these hardliners, but instead to send more sweet Hallmark cards to President Trump to flatter him and to see if they can't prevail in the next go-around.
All right, so let's dig down on some of these issues. Obviously the president is the president and the decider, but who really was at fault for the bad preparation? I mean, Steve Biegun is a competent, smart professional. Arguably, he can only do so much. Pompeo is also a smart guy. Who's responsible for the lack of preparation?
I think the obvious and the straightforward answer is that the president signaled that he wanted to be the guy to make the deal. And the proposition that was being tested, and Steve and Secretary Pompeo were very clear about this, proposition that was being tested was that there was a personal relationship, some magical chemistry between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un that was going to prove to be the secret ingredient, that sort of magic element that would make this time different from all the others. The problem, and I'm not the only person who warned about this 9 months ago in connection with the summit in Singapore, is that when you start diplomacy at the very top, you have nowhere to go but down. And once it is demonstrated that the leaders can't close a deal, the ability of in this case of the United States, to engage at a level of negotiators and apply real leverage is badly undermined. It is going to be harder now to get traction in a working level negotiation than it would have been if the culminating event, if the pot of gold at the end of that rainbow was going to be a summit with the President of the United States.
But it seems to me that there are a couple of ways this could have played out. One, yes, Trump is the ultimate source of knowledge, and yet Biegun and Pompeo would have actually have done groundwork beforehand. They would have done what you had done in the past, which is to prepare options, know what your bottom line is, but also have a sense of what your trade-offs will be if the other side says X, Y, or Z. Did they actually even, and while still leaving the leader, some space to maneuver, did they even go into this negotiation with those kinds of options on paper?
Yes. Look, Steve Biegun is a smart, experienced veteran of both government and business. Similarly, Secretary Pompeo's very smart, very tough-minded, very experienced. Neither of them are particularly steeped in the arcane art of North Korea, but right. Nevertheless, they have available to them, both in the intelligence community, the defense community, and the diplomatic, the State Department community, a lot of expertise, and have at times drawn on it. Yeah, I think that both Secretary Pompeo and Steve Biegun made a valiant effort to both prepare positions and to engage the North Koreans. They had two problems. There were two essential parties who just weren't having any of that. Mm-hmm. One was the North Koreans, and the other was Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. President Trump is not thought to have been successful as a presidential candidate by slavishly following the guidance of the experts. Nor has he run his administration based on the inherited experience and principles that governed Obama and Bush and Clinton and so on. He has made it a virtue to depart from the norm and to, as he has put it, to trust his gut, to trust his instinct. The problem, however, is that while it is better that he walked away from a bad deal than had he consummated it, this isn't real estate. You can't walk away from the North Korean threat. You can't declare bankruptcy on the international effort to get North Korea to comply with international law.
Do you think, though, that if Trump were focused on this, and had taken the advice of his advisors, that there could have been a deal in Hanoi, or at least an agreement to, a basis on which to move forward, something concrete. Could he have taken what the North Koreans gave him and tried to reshape it in a way that would foster a future negotiation?
Well, he certainly could have made a deal in Hanoi, and I was afraid that he would.
No, I mean a good deal. I'm saying, could something concrete have actually come out of that meeting if he had the skill, the will, whatever?
So I think that it's misleading to think in terms of deals. Although deals are very much the currency of President Trump and the Trump administration, this is really a process.
Right.
It's a process of aligning two very different strategic sets of objectives between the U.S. and North Korea, not to mention the fact that the strategic interests of China, Russia, Japan, South Korea enter into the equation in a dramatic way. So could there be a quick deal forged between...
I wasn't saying quick deal.
Well, okay.
I meant, could he have salvaged that situation in a way that would have prepared some profitable ground for moving forward?
Yeah, I don't know. I certainly want to believe that it's possible. What I'll say, though, is that the factors that set the stage for North Korea's desire to find a deal were the coercive effects of sanctions. And I think that the turnaround that Tom mentioned at the outset, at the beginning of 2018, in the run-up to the Olympics in South Korea, when Kim Jong Un first signaled that he was prepared to hit the pause button and set aside his big nuclear button. I think that was definitely the function of the North Korean leader recognizing that China was now actively enforcing UN Security Council sanctions. The sanctions themselves were vastly more rigorous, and that while Kim Jong Un wasn't perhaps in immediate jeopardy, he certainly doesn't look like he was going hungry, he nevertheless could see where this was going to lead, that by the end of 2018, the North Korean economy would be in shambles, that he was in a tough spot. And he did what his father and grandfather before him have done, which is to pivot to a charm offensive. Now, to me, the critical moment that was wasted was the moment when that formidable degree of coercive pressure from sanctions and from the tight unity among the five key parties could have brought Kim to the table on terms that are acceptable to us. Mm-hmm. So the short answer, I think, to your question, Carol, is this. The terms that were kind of on the table for a deal when President Trump went to Singapore and went to Hanoi were not, will North Korea comply fully with its legal obligations under all the UN Security Council resolutions? That's an obligation, not an option. Those were not the terms. The terms were, what is it worth to you, America, to keep this relative peace and quiet, this freeze going a little bit longer? It was a kind of eBay auction. How much are you willing to pay? Mm-hmm. So I think there was something fundamentally flawed about the premise that the U.S. engaged on. Now, I'm not saying there's no way or was no way to claw it back to a better place, but we were beginning from a serious disadvantage.
So has the United States now, I mean, is it irrevocable, or at least for the foreseeable future, that the position of the U.S. is so weakened. As you said, sanctions have, the enforcement of sanctions has declined. Kim has, legitimacy on the world stage that he had, and his father never had. Is the moment lost for the moment?
I don't think we have the option of reconciling ourselves to failure. The fact is that the United States has leverage and has the ability to create better leverage, principally by repairing the unity among the key actors. That means with China in the first instance. It means better alignment with South Korea, with Japan, and even with Russia. Second, it I think is incumbent on the United States to find unity internally as well. I'm not suggesting Democrats and Republicans, because I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for a smart strategy towards denuclearization. But I mean unity within the administration itself, so that all messages to the North Koreans are consistent messages. None of this bobbing, weaving, dodging, hiding. Do I agree with the president? Well, I'm just the national security advisor. I'm not the national security decider. You really have to have a single unified strategy in order to be able to deal with as formidable an opponent as North Korea.
So how do you interpret, what do you see as China's reaction to all of this, and what is China going to be willing to support the United States in a unified policy going forward?
I think we began to see a widening of the gaps between China and the United States as far as North Korea policy is concerned when the president began his talk about a bloody nose and talk about fire and fury. I worked very closely with all of our diplomatic partners in Asia, including and especially the Chinese, over the 8 years. I was in the White House and then in the State Department. And I'm convinced that the Chinese are dead serious when they say that they are committed to the full denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I have no doubt about that. But I would say that denuclearization is not exactly everyone's, including China's, first priority. I think that China's first priority is maintaining stability on their borders. It means avoiding war, avoiding chaos. So denuclearization is a goal, but it comes second to keeping things calm. And when President Trump in the United States began threatening to destroy North Korea, began talking openly about preemptive strikes and so on, it caused China to rethink its approach. Now, in the first instance, that led to more pressure on North Korea to quiet down and to behave. But more broadly, and particularly when President Trump reversed course and decided that he was, without consultation or preparation, announcing his intent to meet in Singapore with Kim Jong Un, it caused the Chinese to conclude that they really needed to have their own independent, separate approach to North Korea and not be dependent on the inconsistent and perhaps unreliable U.S. approach.
So what do you think about the president's decision to continue to suspend military exercises with the South Koreans? Was that a smart idea or not?
Well, it appeared to me that the president had backed into that decision in Singapore last June when, without any consultation with our allies, let alone with the Pentagon, he agreed to cancel the upcoming Alchi Freedom Guardian, the major fall joint defense exercise between the U.S. and South Korea. I thought that was a dreadful mistake. in and of itself for a couple of reasons. One is that that is a defensive exercise. It's not an offensive, aggressive one. North Korea knows that perfectly well. Those exercises have been conducted for many, many years. North Korea conducts its own equivalent exercises. Those haven't been canceled or postponed. The exercises are not, as the president said, war games. This is how the soldiers are trained in the defense of South Korea and of U.S. forces and citizens in the event of a crisis or an attack. It's no game. It's part of America's deterrence. And what the president clearly wasn't thinking about in Singapore was the fact that if he were to cancel this round of exercises as a quid pro quo for North Korea graciously refraining from committing an illegal act, then what was going to happen when the next cycle of exercises came out? And that's precisely what has happened. So yeah, I think this is a bad deal. We are paying rent, if not extortion money, to North Korea to get it to agree to not do something that it is not allowed to do. And what we are paying degrades our defense and our deterrence capability. I think that's very dangerous.
On the other hand, in the context of a negotiation, the fact that the North Koreans continue to have this cessation on moratorium on nuclear and missile testing, and a suspension of military exercises, isn't there some, balance there?
Well, look, there's no question that it is far better that North Korea not actively test its missiles and its nuclear devices than that it go ahead with them at a pace that it pursued in 2017. No question about that. But let's not lose sight of the first principle here, which is that what North Korea was doing, has been doing, is a direct violation of international law, is in direct contravention from its own commitments. So we need to think carefully about what we are going to pay in order for North Korea voluntarily to refrain temporarily from, in effect, committing a crime. Yes, it is worth rewarding good behavior by North Korea, but trying to pay North Korea off is a fool's errand. It is extortion.
So would you not have done anything? You would have demanded that they, halt the testing and just left it at that. The United States would have not taken any reciprocal or, action.
No, there in any effort, in any negotiation, clearly there has to be give and take. The United States has a wealth of things at its disposal that it can offer North Korea in terms of concessions, whether it has to do with sanctions, whether it has to do with diplomatic normalization, whether it has to do with economic assistance, humanitarian aid, gestures of respect, the list goes on. Our defensive military deployments and deterrence are not the chips that any responsible government should reach for early on. And to accept the premise that there's some equivalency between North Korea's illicit nuclear program and the legitimate joint defense of Korea and Japan by U.S. forces is to concede ground to North Korea that is indefensible.
Okay, I've got lots more questions, but I don't want to be a hog. So who wants to? Sir.
Danny, thank you as always for the clarity you bring to murky situations. I can't help but wonder if we don't run the same risk when the President and Xi Jinping get together at the end of this month to talk about trade, of misunderstanding, lack of preparation, no deal.
Well, that's a fair and a good question. Where to begin? The trade issues that are in dispute between the United States and China, important, are just a subset of the overall area of friction right now between Beijing and Washington. And while it is not hard to, for me to imagine, and it's been available for some considerable amount of time, that President Trump could opt for a deal that basically trades a freeze on the raise of, or the imposition of additional tariffs by the United States for significant purchases by China. That's sort of the basic deal that's always been available. That deal falls far short of addressing either the structural issues, such as the lack of U.S. market access, or the issues pertaining to intellectual property, forced transfer of technology, and the prejudicial advantage of national champions in order to gain the upper hand in high tech. But it also does nothing to address the other areas of friction, namely the declaration by the United States, beginning in the national security strategy adopted early by the administration, that China is a revisionist power, is a strategic rival, is an adversary, is de facto an enemy. So those are big problems. There's no question that the Chinese side wants to make the pain stop and is looking for a deal. Unlike North Korea, China has been engaged in very active negotiations on the trade side between Bob Lighthizer and Liu He. What we don't know, and what we presumably will see after March 27th or 28th in Mar-a-Lago, is whether a deal has been reached that will stick, and whether that deal goes beyond just commodities and, in effect, buy-offs by the Chinese, or whether it gets credibly into the issues of structural disagreement.
Sir.
Two-part question. First of all, thank you.
Could you identify yourself?
Ken Wasserman, I'm an attorney. To what extent is there a downside to the United States for not encouraging a treaty to end the Korean War? And second of all, when you said that the U.S.-South Korean exercises were defensive only, could you discuss, or would you agree that the dichotomy between defensive and offensive is rather unclear?
Sure. There's the technicality that in 1953 the Korean conflict ended with a truce, with an armistice rather than a peace treaty, is a distant second in terms of risk and problems to the nuclear issue, to the fact that North Korea has so aggressively and so successfully developed both nuclear weapons and the means of delivery. And so the notion that addressing sort of problem number two ahead of problem number one works to our advantage, I think, is a very debatable proposition. In particular, I think that since we know clearly from North Korea that one of its key objectives is to undermine the rationale for the U.S.-South Korean alliance, and therefore create pressure domestically in South Korea to send Yankees back home and end the deployment of U.S. forces Korea. The idea that President Trump and Chairman Kim would issue an end-of-war declaration was something that I and many analysts had great reservations about. You can declare war, but you can't just declare peace. You have to build it. And while engineering a peace treaty or a peace arrangement that would be durable has always been one of the objectives of U.S. negotiators in dealing with North Korea, we have also always understood, number one, that it can't precede a resolution of the North Korean nuclear issue. You may be able to negotiate them in tandem, but you can't have peace and a threatening North Korean nuclear posture. And secondly, that it's not something that the U.S. and North Korea can do alone, because China was a belligerent, South Korea was both a belligerent and a victim. At a minimum, it has to be the four countries working on a peace treaty, a peace arrangement. But it's really, I think, putting the cart before the horse, and it would not have worked to the U.S. advantage to declare peace on the Korean Peninsula when there is none. In terms of U.S. South Korean defensive exercises, my experience is that the North Koreans have a very sophisticated understanding of U.S. military doctrine and U.S. military deployments. They know perfectly well that the purpose of exercises like Key Resolve and Full Eagle are, number one, to train the South Korean conscripted army that, when you think about it, rotates personnel 100% every 2 years or so. And every year that you go without a rehearsal, without a practice of the integration between U.S. forces and South Korean forces, you're producing a South Korean army that just doesn't have the skills and the experience to support the U.S. military in a crisis. Second, the North Koreans fully understand the difference between, say, a B-52 or a B-2 bomber from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam overflying the Korean Peninsula. Those are strategic assets capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. The North Koreans know when a U.S. nuclear submarine surfaces off the Korean Peninsula and what that implies. And they can differentiate that from basic, traditional, sort of bread and butter exercises, which frankly are quite similar to the exercises that North Korea itself conducts in the winter and in the summer. These are exercises that are built around the predicate that the other side has attacked us. What do we do? How do we demonstrate that they would get this far, no further, be rolled back, and be made to pay a big price? That's what makes those exercises defensive, and I honestly believe that North Korea, which has a profound interest in understanding this and has made this the object of great professional study, knows exactly what it is that we are and aren't doing in these exercises.
Anybody on this side of the room? Okay, sir, and then you.
Wang Dong from Chinese Council in New York. And to me, the Hanoi summit like a drama with anticipation and surprise, shock. At the beginning, everybody optimistic, and all of a sudden, everything changed. And I noticed that is one day before the Hanoi summit, there's a Michael Cohen hearing in the Congress. So I'm wondering how the U.S. domestic politics affect the summit, especially the Mueller investigation report coming out in a few days, and how it affected the ongoing China-U.S. trade negotiation, and also Mar-a-Lago summit probably happen at the end of this month. Thank you.
I'd like to defer that to Carol, who knows better than I do. What I can say is that domestic problems in a democratic system like America's can have one or two effects. It could cause the U.S. leader to make concessions, or it could cause the U.S. leader to double down and hunker down and toughen up. We'll see what happens. There was every reason to think that President Trump went to Hanoi desirous of a deal, both for strategic reasons, but perhaps for political reasons. And yet, in the event, he didn't. It's hard to imagine that President Trump would invite President Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago without intending to reach a deal, but stranger things have happened, and we will see. I think what we can estimate with a high degree of confidence is that Donald Trump was not the only leader in Hanoi last week watching CNN. Kim Jong Un did not overlook the fact that the U.S. president is facing immense legal and political challenges. And that reinforces what's already a very strong skepticism among North Korean elites that it's safe to make a deal with the United States. And not only has North Korea learned a bitter lesson from the agreed framework of the Clinton years, which I had at least a small hand in negotiating, not only has the North Korean side seen in a transition from Clinton to Bush, and then from Bush to Obama, from Obama to Trump, some significant changes in position. And they've seen the U.S. Congress, when it flipped back in the 90s, in effect repudiate a deal. Since President Trump has taken office, they've seen him personally repudiate deals like the JCPOA Iran deal, like the TPP. And they therefore ask themselves with some justice, well, what good would a promise be? They're not into taking the word of an American leader that everything's going to be okay. They're very conscious of the 4-year electoral cycle. And they have a tendency to try to wait out a leader they think may be on the downslide on the way out, and try again with the next one.
The woman with the turtleneck.
This is Mayako from TBS. Thank you very much for your time. I have a question in regards to the Hanoi summit. As far as I understand, there was the leaked document right before the summit launched by Vox for matters, and South Korean official called it was too good a deal for North Korea. And then this summit was toward the end, it was sort of like stopped and Trump walked away. And at the press conference in the Singapore summit, President Trump stood by himself, spoke out of his mind. But this time at Hanoi, Secretary Pompeo stood right next to President Trump. And when Trump was asked why he walked away, he gave a microphone to Pompeo and let him speak. And I would like to ask you your take on what exactly happened, and given the fact that North Koreans gave rare press conference afterward, saying that they only requested partial relaxation of sanctions, which is actually, as Americans said, counterpart said, those 5 UN sanctions are the core part of all the sanctions imposed on North Korea. So basically all of the sanctions. So what is your take on what happened in Hanoi?
Well, as I said, I think the U.S. side came to Hanoi with a big gamble, offering a grand bargain. It was built in a way on that 4-minute sort of real estate type promo video that President Trump showed to the North Koreans in Singapore. This glorious future can be all yours, no money down, sign here on the dotted line. That was not to be. The North Koreans came with a proposal that was heavily skewed in their favor, but not impossible to imagine Americans accepting, particularly the Trump administration, that would have traded much of the Yongbyon nuclear site, which is the biggest and the only publicly acknowledged nuclear site in North Korea, for the lifting of much of the UN Security Council's sanctions. Now, it's extraordinary that Lee Young-ho, the North Korean foreign minister, conducted an impromptu, middle-of-the-night press conference. You don't see that very often. I think it's evidence that North Korea is battling for, let's say, dominance in the international understanding of what happened. And North Korea only has to make the case that it's not being unreasonable to benefit. So what we're seeing now is the unintended consequence of the way that President Trump has pursued this personal diplomacy, has declared Kim Jong Un a decent guy, an honorable guy, someone that he loves, etc., is that North Korea's isolation has ended. Its pariah status has ended. That's of immeasurable value to North Korea because it links very directly to a fraying of the ability and the willingness of third countries to actively implement UN Security Council sanctions. That combined with with President Moon's pursuit of rapprochement has opened the door to waivers of sanctions, of a lot of potential commercial and other economic opportunities for North Korea. And it's certainly opened the floodgates of sanctions evasion. Not that countries are actively deciding to cheat, but simply that reduced enforcement and a sense that, well, North Korea is behaving better opens space for North Korea itself to evade sanctions. In the meantime, what is important to recognize is that not only has North Korea gotten liberated from its pariah status, and not only has North Korea gotten U.S. military exercises turned off, but North Korea's nuclear program continues to grow. No one has, either on the U.S. or the North Korean side, has for a moment suggested that North Korea has stopped its production of nuclear material and nuclear weapons. In fact, according to research by RAND, just since the Singapore summit, North Korea has increased its stockpile of nuclear material, and North Korea has increased the destructive power of its nuclear weapons, in part through R&D, in part through miniaturization, to the point where they're estimating now that there has been something on the order of a 70% increase in the lethality and the destructive capability of North Korea's nuclear weapons program in less than a year. And so the status quo is not our friend here. And any agreement or any negotiation that focuses merely on sustaining a freeze that we have to pay for, is just postponing a crisis. North Korean freezes have a nasty habit of thawing out. And so in the absence of a credible negotiating process, we have to be prepared that the big button on Kim Jong Un's desk is going to be back in play before too long.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay, I'm going to take a question from the moderator's inbox. And the questioner asks, is there a role for South Korea? It seems that when Trump and Kim meet, they are not, the South Koreans are really not part of the discussion. And what about Japan? They too are a target.
Yes. I feel convinced that the only approach to North Korea that has a chance of successfully halting, rolling back, and ultimately eliminating its nuclear and ballistic missile program is a unified, combined approach by the U.S., South Korea, China, Japan, and Russia. North Korea thrives in the gaps between the major powers. North Korea has made, over the centuries, not just in the Kim dynasty, an art form of playing one power off against each other. And when you ask yourself what accounted for the tremendous pressure on North Korea in 2017, what was it that brought Kim to say on New Year's Day of 2018, okay, this is enough, we're going to change directions? It was the fact that wherever he turned, whether it was Beijing or Seoul or Tokyo or Moscow or Washington, he heard the same thing, an unwavering insistence that he had to come into compliance with the UN Security Council resolutions. Once the divisions between Seoul and Washington started to manifest themselves, and once President Trump decided that he was going to do it himself, even though there has been a considerable amount of communication between the U.S. and the South Korean leaders, the U.S. and Japanese leaders, communication between the foreign ministers and so on, communication isn't the same as coordination, and they have been surprised again and again at decisions that were made. So in the case of Japan, which is directly threatened by short-range ballistic missiles, a North Korean agreement to suspend testing only on long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles isn't quite the glorious outcome that they like, because they remain at risk. It is essential that the United States reforge the common front so that Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, Moscow, and Washington are all saying the same thing to Pyongyang.
So, Danny, thank you so much for your thoughtful answers, and thanks to all of you for attending.
Thank you, Carol.